All right, so let's jump into your persuasive speeches. And this is something that I actually am going to spend quite a bit of time going through as I get you to look at the delivery of a persuasive speech, hopefully completely different than that of an informative speech. As we move through the assignment for your persuasive speech, I want you to understand that there are quite a few things that I'm going to ask you to deliberately do in order to make sure that your speech is persuasive and not informative. Now, the first thing that I want you to look at is I want you to look at the notion and the difference between persuasion and informative. So, what is persuasion? Well, persuasion is the process of influencing another person's values, beliefs, attitudes, or behaviors through information. It's not the same as coercion, so you can't force somebody to do something, but rather you're giving them the information, the pros, the cons. You're allowing them to look at all different points of the argument, and with that information, your goal is to transform them in one way or another. But I need to know how, I need you to know, how you want to transform them. And so early on in the top of your outline, you're going to tell me. Now, we know that your general purpose this time is to persuade. And in the past, I taught you that the specific purpose was your general purpose plus the intended audience plus the objective of your speech. But now I'm going to actually shift your specific purpose just a little bit more, because your general purpose is going to stay to persuade, but your specific purpose is either going to start with to convince, to move, or to inspire. I want you to know right at the get-go, before you even begin your speech, what are you trying to do to the audience? Are you trying to convince them to change? Now, if you're trying to convince them to change, then your audience analysis will have told you that a majority of your class disagrees with the message that you are trying to send. So you're only trying to convince us if we have different viewpoints. Are you trying to move the audience into some sort of action? Do you want them to actually do something? Is there going to be a call to action at the end of your speech that's going to require some sort of action? If so, then your specific purpose will start with to move. Or are you trying to inspire the audience? So to convince the audience means that a majority of the audience or your target audience disagrees with you. But if a majority of your audience or the target audience already agrees with you, then you are trying to inspire them to strengthen their commitment. So just because your audience agrees with you doesn't mean that you need to change your topic. Instead, it means you need to dig deeper to figure out what it is that the audience knows and how can you strengthen that. So let's go back then, because the top of your outline, the general purpose again remains to persuade, but the specific purpose either starts off to convince, to move, to inspire, and then you name your intended audience and follow that with the objective of your speech. Once you know exactly what it is that you are trying to do to the audience, then you have to look at what are the steps that you have to take in order to be persuasive. And persuasion actually requires you to be specific and deliberate in everything that you are doing and saying. So some of you may have been wondering, why am I so particular on outlining? Why do I make you understand the 3 different type of transition sentences and the different types of supporting material and all the things that I really focused on the first speech, the informative speech? And the reason why I did that in the first speech is so that we can build on it in the second speech, or the persuasive speech. And so each of the areas, each supporting material, each transition sentence, everything in your outline will actually be used as a way to push your message across. So you're looking at this right here, and it starts on the top with state a position, analyze the issues, challenge the opposing views, propose a solution, present reasons, produce evidence, provide qualifications, address listeners' interests and sympathies. And each of these steps needs to be in every single one of your speeches. But oftentimes students get stuck thinking that it has to just be in the main points or the subpoints. And I want you to understand that absolutely every part of the outline should be geared towards persuasion. So state of position can actually be in your topic statement, in the introduction. Analyze the issues. It can be subpoints, it can be main points, it can even be internal transition sentences. The one thing that my students oftentimes struggle with, which is probably one of the most important things in a persuasive speech, is the challenge opposing views. You want to make sure that you allow the audience to hear what other people have to say. And that's the first thing. But the second thing is, and I think this is probably more important, is the reason why you address the opposing views and then explain why they're wrong, or why you don't agree with them, or what the facts say, is because there are probably going to be people in the audience that know the opposing views. And you want to answer any questions that they may have before they have an opportunity to stop listening. So look for what the opposing side of your speech is. Think about, how do you draw people in? How do you keep people listening? And then how do you acknowledge that there is another side, but what can you do to try to reduce that and alleviate some of the power that it has? Make sure you propose a solution, because every speech that is a question of policy speech, and we'll get to what that is in a little bit, but every speech that is a question of policy speech has to have a solution. And you need to present reasons why that solution is the best solution there is, and evidence that will prove that that solution is actually going to benefit all of us. You're going to make sure that you cite sources, and you're going to provide the qualifications. And all throughout the speech, you're going to be addressing this to the audience based on an audience analysis that you have completed. You will see in the upcoming week that you have to develop an audience analysis questionnaire, upload it onto the discussion board, and then each of you needs to respond to at least 10 of your classmates' audience analysis, so that everybody can develop a speech that is directly to this particular class. Now, the requirement is a minimum of 10. Guys, it takes less than 5 minutes to complete each one. So I encourage you to do as many audience analysis as you can. I try to do every single one. Unless you get super personal, then I won't do them. But that really helps if we can do more than we are required to do. Now, I said I was going to talk about this in a second, so I'm getting to it now. And there is more information in the modules on the difference between a question of fact, a question of value, and a question of policy speech. You have to have a question of policy speech. So I want you to start right there, recognizing that your purpose for this persuasive speech is to advocate some sort of action, some sort of behavior, some sort of change, some sort of movement. Now, whether you are trying to convince, to move, or to inspire us is a completely different issue. I don't want you to do a question of fact speech. And a question of fact speech, really, it's just giving us information. It's just information that we can look up. A question of value speech is talking about the morality of something. So, for instance, if you're doing a question of value speech and you're persuading us to wear seatbelts, and the only thing that you're talking about is the lives that would be saved, and it's not necessarily deep in terms of research, nor in terms of impact or effect, with a speech on persuading people to wear their seatbelts, oftentimes students will try to talk about car accidents and how somebody is hurt or killed if they don't have their seatbelt on. And a lot of times when you have a question of value speech, your audience members get stuck into the not me more mentality. Well, that happens to somebody else. I don't need to wear my seatbelt. I'm just going across the street. So you're going to focus on delivering a question of policy speech, which means, though, that you have to be audience centered. And so I go back to this audience analysis, because if you are going to shift your specific purpose to convince, to move, or to inspire, and you're going to advocate some sort of action through your question of policy speech, you need to know who your audience is. You need to know your audience disposition, your audience needs, and your audience's responses to your topic. You need to tailor your speech to the audience's values and their reservations or their concerns. But look at this picture, right? Now, this is your target audience. It should be the majority, so the picture's a little off. But you are speaking to the majority of your audience. You are not speaking to the outliers, the one or two that don't agree with you. Don't create your entire speech just for a few. Your speech should be created for the entire audience. I want to stop for a minute and I want to tell you something that's, I think, one of the most important things that you should learn in this short little video today. And that is, we cannot persuade people to change behaviors. I know we'd like to, right? Like, we'd like to persuade people to quit smoking or to start exercising. But the truth is you cannot persuade people to change behaviors. They may change them for a short while. But if you're really going to change someone's behaviors, you have to work at their values, their attitudes, and their beliefs. So let's say that you wanted to persuade people to quit smoking, for instance. Then what you have to make sure that you do is you don't focus on the behavior of smoking. Rather, you focus on the values behind smoking, the attitude about longevity of life, the beliefs about health. Because persuading people requires you to do 4 things. First, you're asking the listeners to seek out information that supports their views so that you can get them to re-examine their views. Listeners tend to seek out information they agree with, and that's why I read it this way, you guys. You need to know what your audience agrees with, because if you're trying to get them to re-examine their views, you have to connect it to things they already know. You have to, as a speaker, have realistic expectations. Ask for reasonable amounts of change. Don't expect to make 32 meat-eating people vegans from your 7 to 9 minute speech. You want to engage the audience in a mental give and take. Answer questions before they have the opportunity to stop listening to you. And that's the part that I talked about with challenge the opposing viewpoints. And finally, acknowledge that the audience has feelings and ideas, and never ask the audience to do something you would not do. Persuasion is more than just putting together facts in a speech. Persuasion is about knowing who you're talking to and tailoring a speech specifically to them. So if you look at this chart, it basically summarizes everything that I just said. In an informative speech, your goal is to increase knowledge, to define, describe, demonstrate, or explain. You want the audience to know more than they did before they listen to your speech. And you want the audience just willingly listen and gain new information. But in a persuasive speech, your sole goal is to change the mind of the audience, to make them want to do some sort of action. You're trying to shape them, reinforce an idea, or actually change the audience because you want them to feel or think differently, to behave or act differently, to critically evaluate the message. Ultimately, you want the audience to choose to change their behavior by their choice, to be inspired or convinced by your credibility, your logical explanation, and your emotional appeal.